Hello, everyone. This is going to be a short talk to go with your second week class on a reading by Baz Dreisinger from Incarceration Nations. So I think it's important to recognize that when a model or a set of policies like mass incarceration is exported, that it's not the same as when a produced good is exported. So, for example, if a computer is made in the United States and it's exported as plug and play, essentially it can be taken out of the box, plugged in, and it's ready to go. It doesn't really make much difference what the social or political or economic context is that it's going to operate in. However, that's not the same with social systems, sets of policies, systems of oppression that we're talking about, like mass incarceration. Let me give another example. When we look at the offshoring of manufacturing production, that is the movement of factories from the Midwest of the United States to places like the border production sites in Mexico or the special economic zones of China, we find that the social political context has a great impact on what that transference of production looks like. So whereas in the United States we found that manufacturing production took place in places like Chicago or Milwaukee, where the workforce was largely white men working as members of unions with fairly good wages, benefits, and job security. But when that production process was transferred to Mexico or China, we find that the workforce changed. It became mostly women doing this work. We find that these were not typically unionized workplaces, and the wages, benefits, and job security were highly reduced, more to gear up and help the companies make more profit off that production. So I think when we think of the movement of the model or the set of policies known as mass incarceration or system of oppression, if you will, we have to think about what is the country that it's moving into, that it's not going to be a plug-and-play situation, but rather we have to look at the situations in those countries. So I want to look particularly at three countries that we'll be examining during this session. That is Britain, and then Brazil and South Africa. So if we look at Britain or the United Kingdom, we find that this is part of the Western European countries that historically have developed systems of social democracy, or what some people refer to as the welfare state. And although the welfare state benefits have reduced in recent decades, there's still a substantial remnant of that system. So, for example, in Britain and the other countries of Western Europe, we find national health services, which are basically free. We find in many countries higher education is free. We find a large amount of public housing. We find lots of mental health facilities, drug treatment facilities. All of these things are very commonplace and expected. There is pension systems and paid vacation for workers, paid parental leave for workers. All of these kinds of things are part of the fabric of the political economy in these countries. But that's not the case in the United States. It's very different. So it's being exported from the United States into these social democratic or welfare state economies like Britain, which means that the sort of pure kind of mass incarceration, which has led to huge increases in the incarcerated populations and a highly racialized, racially skewed prison population, is not as extreme when it moves into places like the United Kingdom. So when we find the adoption of zero tolerance or tough on crime policies in European countries, we find that it results in a few changes. Some privatization, for example, the building of supermax prison facilities, and the imposition of some mandatory minimum sentencing laws. But overall, we find slight increases in prison populations and not a huge transformation in society. However, we do find that, as in the United States, the targets of this, the people who are most directly impacted, tend to be people of color. In the United Kingdom, this is black people. But we find that the whole transformation of the criminal justice, indeed the social system that's taken place in the United States as a result of mass incarceration, has not really occurred in Britain or in the Western European social democracies. Now, we have a very different situation when we come to countries like Brazil and South Africa. First of all, both of those countries have histories in fairly recent times, at least in the last half century or so, of systems of authoritarian rule. In Brazil, we had a military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. In South Africa, we had the well-known system of racial segregation known as apartheid from 1948 to 1994. So both of those systems were highly undemocratic, and both of those systems severely targeted black people in particular. Brazil having the largest black population of any country outside of the African continent, and South Africa being a country that really is about 85% black, and the apartheid system being specifically set up to privilege the political and economic power of the white population. So both of the governments that came into power post-military dictatorship in Brazil and post-apartheid in South Africa had in mind a project that would somehow push toward more equality and economic equity for those who had been disadvantaged during the previous systems. But all of these promises were not so easy to realize. So in both of these countries, one of the important things that happened is that people who lived in rural areas began to flock to urban areas because urban areas were seen as the sites of opportunities, sites of employment, sites for education, sites for real advancement that had been denied under authoritarian systems. So one of the results is that in Brazil, in cities like Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, we find the emergence of massive, what we call favelas, informal housing areas where hundreds of thousands of people live in systems that are somewhat outside of the legal system. People live in these houses without any title deeds to the land. Their houses can be sometimes destroyed by police on short notice. And we find that the opportunity that people expected to find in urban areas is not really available to lots of people in these favelas, so that they resort to what we call the underground economy. So the underground economy may involve home production. It may involve women making clothes and selling them, men making furniture and selling them. It may involve providing transportation systems. It may involve a whole lot of provision of services such as childcare. But overall, we have an economy that essentially exists outside of the tax system and outside of the kind of governmental regulations. And of course, within that underground economy, we have the more specifically illegal activities such as selling of drugs, such as sex work, and so forth. So all of these things have created a situation whereby these favelas have become not only areas of informal economic activity, but they've also become sites where organized crime, or what we know as gangs, have emerged as a significant political force and an economic force. So that these favelas have been areas of crime and violence, much of the violence directed against the poor citizens of the favelas, but also we find in response massive police violence directed supposedly against organized crime, but eventually spreading over into the general population. And so we've seen a similar thing happen in South Africa, where settlements of hundreds of thousands of people, which were formerly known as squatter camps, but are now called informal settlements have emerged with very similar patterns occurring. Informal housing, which is insecure, underground economy dominates, and the rise of gangs, which have marshaled a lot of the control over economic activity, but also have become perpetrators of violence in the community, and in turn we've seen increased police violence. So, and in both of these countries, unlike in the United States, the crime that has taken place in these low-income areas, which are overwhelmingly populated by black people, the crimes that have taken place are not only directed at the residents of those informal settlements, but they're also directed at the wealthy areas. So we find crimes like carjackings, home invasions, burglaries, house robberies, all kinds of things spilling over into the wealthier areas where most of the white population lives. And we find that this has prompted outcries from that population, which still wields considerable economic and political power, for some kind of war on crime. And that war on crime fits in well with the system of mass incarceration that we've seen in the United States. In fact, we've seen, of course, that the precipitator of mass incarceration was the cries for wars on crime, wars on drugs, and so forth, which, as in the United States, have a very racialized tone in both Brazil and South Africa. So what's happened is that the importation of the mass incarceration model into these societies has led to a highly increased militarization of the police. A rash of violent activity by the police, resulting in the case of Brazil, thousands of police murders of people, and similar things happening in South Africa. But also we've seen that the importation of things like mandatory minimum sentencing, truth in sentencing, the building of super maximum prisons and so forth, and some increased expenditure on corrections has swelled the prison population enormously. But of course, in these countries, which are still very unequal, with large swaths of the population living in world-class poverty, in these countries, there hasn't been the finances to build the kinds of prisons and jails that we've seen sprout up across the United States. Instead, what's happened is that people have been packed into the existing facilities, and we've seen incredible situations of overcrowding in Brazilian and South African prisons on a scale that we really do not see in the United States. And this overcrowding has led to uprisings in these prisons, spates of violence in these prisons, violent responses by authorities in these prisons, to the extent that it's become a national problem. And within Brazil and South Africa, we now find serious debates about whether or not this growth of the prison system, this increasing use of incarceration, has at all helped solve the problem of crime, or whether it's created another system of problems and oppression that now needs to be addressed. So you'll see in the discussions this week, we will look at some of the debates within the South African context and within the Brazilian context about whether or not this situation, this system of mass incarceration, has been effective, and how the problems that have been created by mass incarceration need now to be addressed by the governments in those countries. I'll look forward to the discussions in class. I hope you enjoy the reading by Baz Dreisinger. Thank you.